Shalom, it's Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com, and I brought something for show and tell to help us understand the Hebrew word for rabbi and what it actually means. Of course, this is important because Jesus was and is a rabbi. His disciples called him rabbi lots of times. So we're going to learn about how the Hebrew word for rabbi is actually related to the Hebrew word for an archer, someone who shoots arrows, and how it's also related to two other words. And before we look at that, I thought I would, for show and tell, bring you my bow. This is a survival bow, and it says the body is made of aircraft-grade aluminum, and it has two arms that fold right into the body. Can you see that? The two arms of the bow fold right into the body, and then they fold out. So check this out. I'll just show you how it works. See, so the arms fold out like that. And then you just twist this little knob like yay. And unfortunately, I can't show you the full length. And then, of course, you have to string it. You can see the knocks on the end there, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's what they're called for it. And then, of course, it just, it bends like a bow bends with the string, and you can fire arrows from it. That's it's my ninja bow. I also have a ninja sword and a ninja knife and a ninja baseball bat, but I'm not going to show those today. Those are my own little secrets. I also have a ninja body, actually. I train at an MMA gym several times a week, so I don't need no weapons. These elbows are weapons. Boom. So anyways, that's a bow for you that shoots arrows, and that's what we are going to talk about in this little takeaway from my most recent Hebrew verses lesson. All right, so if you just use eSword or some Bible software and you search the word rabbi, you'll see that it turns up several times in the writings of the disciples of Rabbi Jesus in the New Testament. And this was the title that they most frequently addressed him as. They actually didn't usually address him as Yeshua, as Jesus. They called him Rabbi, which is, of course, a respectful address to their spiritual teacher. So, for instance, in the Gospel of Mark, Mark was written in collaboration with Peter. Really, it's Peter's memoirs. And there are quite a few personal glimpses of Yeshua in this book that we don't have in the other Gospels. And also we see these little interactions between Peter and Yeshua that aren't in the other Gospels. So for instance, Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here." Again, Peter says, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you've cursed has withered." Judas calls him Rabbi. In the Gospel of John, Yochanan, we see this quite a few times also. And it's actually even translated. It's recognized rabbi is not a Greek word. Rabbi isn't an English word. But they called him this word, and so he translated, which translated means what? Teacher. And yes, rabbi does mean teacher, but it means more than just teacher. Like, for instance, when you were growing up, if you went to public school, your teachers were not your rabbis as such. They weren't rabbis. It would be incorrect to refer to them as rabbis. If you're homeschooled and your parents were your teachers, which was my case, then your parents weren't necessarily your rabbis either just because they taught you some grammar or whatever. Nathaniel calls him Rabbi. Rabbi, you're the Son of God. Nicodemus, Rabbi, we know you've come from God. Over and over again. Rabbi, eat. Rabbi, when did you get here? Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going back there. Okay, so do you get the idea? Jesus was a rabbi. And if you really believe the verse that says Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever, then that means that Jesus is a rabbi. That's why I love to call him Rabbi Jesus, because it helps us to remember that Jesus was Jewish. And his Jewishness didn't just run skin deep either. It wasn't just like an ethnicity, like how I'm part Scottish or whatever. His Jewishness was a deep soul thing. His Jewishness was also religious. It was the religion that he practiced his entire life. And of course it was a religion that was very meaningful because it was an expression of his relationship with his Father. Don't pit religion and relationship against each other. In the case of Yeshua, his relationship with his Father was seamlessly integrated with how that was expressed in the Jewish religion. All right, so that's why I like to call him Rabbi Jesus. It's a reminder of the Jewishness of Christ, the Messiah. It's also why I like to call him Yeshua, his original Hebrew name. So here's the question: Rabbi, what does this mean? Now you see here, Rabbi is translated, which means teacher, but there's way more to it than that. Rabbi is a Hebrew word. And you need to understand two things about the Hebrew language. Firstly, every word in Hebrew is formed from a 3-letter verbal root. So everything in Hebrew comes from action words. It's a very action-packed language, actually very dynamic. And then secondly, every word in Hebrew belongs to a family of related words. And so if you really want to understand the full meaning of a word, you need to look at the family that it belongs to, which can often be the case for us as human beings also. You know, if you meet a kid, you're going to learn some things about the kid. But then if you meet the kid's family and you watch that kid interacting in the context of his or her family, you're going to get to know that kid that much better. And of course, this is also true of adults, for better or worse. Some of us are very proud of our families, and some of us are like, yeah, those family reunions. So, you know, if I'm maybe taking someone out on a first date, we're not going to be going to the family reunion on that first date, or they're never going to talk to me again. Okay, but when it comes to Hebrew, when you look at the word that a family, the family that a word belongs to, you're going to understand it better. So let's do that when it comes to this word rabbi. All right. Now, the first thing you need to understand is the end of this word is E. In Hebrew, if a word ends in E, it means my. Right. So in Hebrew, you don't say rabbi, you say rabbi. Rabbi is how it's pronounced in Hebrew. And that means my, Rav. So the question is, what is a Rav? A Rav basically is a great person. So, you know, if your rabbi is the great person in your life, you know, if you have a teacher and they're teaching you spiritually, that indeed is a very great role. And that's something to be respected and honored and celebrated. That's not a bad thing, of course. You know, we're called to honor our parents who teach us. We're called to honor, you know, the elders in our congregations who work hard at preaching and teaching. It says that they deserve double honor. So this is a good thing. And of course, for, you know, Yeshua as our rabbi, he's the greatest person in our lives. He's the one that we get our worldview from, that we get our relationship with God from. He's the one who like teaches us all the things. That's Rabbi Jesus. All right. So Rav has the sense of someone who is great. But okay, but here's the thing. Rav is a noun. Remember? So what did I just tell you? Everything in Hebrew, all those nouns, they come from verbs. So are you curious? Are you curious what the action word is behind the Hebrew word for rabbi? What does it mean to rabbi, so to speak? You know, like what's the actual verb there? What does a rabbi do? And that's where things get really interesting and meaningful. I want to show you a verse in Hebrew that we just read in the lesson that I filmed. Okay, so this is Genesis chapter 49. I'm doing these Hebrew verses lesson where we just read from like a chapter, half a chapter, from the Hebrew Scriptures, where right now we're working through Genesis, we're almost done, and we're also reading through the Epistle of St. Paul to the Romans in a Hebrew translation, which is a really neat experience. Anyways, okay, so look at this. So Jacob is blessing his sons, and in Genesis chapter 49, he's talking about Joseph, and he says, the archers bitterly attacked him. So he's referring to Joseph's brothers as archers. These blessings are highly poetic. He employs a fair bit of metaphor. You can definitely see that here. The archers bitterly attacked him and shot at him and harassed him. So the verb I want to show you, there are 3 verbs here. The verb I want to show you is the one for shooting at him. Okay, archers shooting at something or somebody. Now, let's look at the Hebrew text together. If you've never seen Hebrew before, hopefully this will be a really meaningful and exciting experience for you. This is Genesis chapter 49 in Hebrew. This is the Bible that Jesus read his whole life, and his disciples. Remember, like they went to synagogue every Saturday at least. Maybe they also went on Mondays and Thursdays. And why did they go to synagogue? Well, they went to study the Torah, to read this stuff. So that's one of the reasons I absolutely love reading the Bible in Hebrew, and I love teaching it, is because it's like following in the footsteps of Yeshua. You know, just in terms of the actual texts and the very words themselves. All right. So this is Genesis chapter 49, verse 23 in Hebrew. I'm just going to read you the verse just so you can hear what Hebrew sounds like if you haven't heard it before. Vayimararuhu, so they were bitter towards him. Varobu, and they shot at him. Vayistamuhu, and that's a big word. Not like they harassed him. Balechitzim, so like the archers. It literally means like the masters of arrows, the arrow masters. Actually, that's kind of a cool word for like archers, hey? Arrow masters. Have you noticed that about archers? There's almost like this romanticism in our culture surrounding archers. Like for instance in movies, Maybe snipers also to a lesser degree. I don't know. Have you ever seen movies where like the sniper was the hero? And I mean, archers and snipers are similar in terms of their actual tactical function. But I'm sure we've all seen movies where there was like an archer, like Robin Hood, for instance, and he's like the hero of the story. And so we kind of have this romanticism about archers, and maybe that can help make this even more interesting. Arrow masters. Okay. So let's look. Okay, so here's the interesting thing. Did you notice that? We're talking about rabbis. Did you notice this word for shooting arrows? Va robu. So va means and. So the word here is robu. Now, let's talk about the verb, this verb for a couple of minutes here. The verb is ravav. And ravav actually, it means three things. We're going to talk about each one of these and what it has to tell us about Yeshua as a rabbi, who he is, what he did, what he does today in our lives and in this world. All right, so the verb is ravav. There's a very closely related verb, rava, and sometimes linguistic scholars aren't even sure which verb is being used because they're so closely related and they're used like almost interchangeably. So I'm just going to talk about ravav, but it also applies to the verb rava, okay? Hopefully I didn't just totally nerd you out. Like, track with me here, okay? Ravav means to shoot arrows, as you can see here. It's like something that archers do. Ravav can also have the sense of getting in a fight. Like, for instance, a reeve. A reeve in Hebrew is like a legal dispute or an argument or a fight. So just remember that. Rabbi, fight. Okay. And then ravav, probably the way it's most frequently used in the scriptures, it means to multiply. Like to be lots of, numerically. And that's how it has the sense of being great. It has the sense of being great in the sense of being like numerically great. So for instance, this is an example for you. God like blesses humanity. In that case, it was Adam and Eve. He says, be fruitful and multiply. And in Hebrew, that's pru, be fruitful, urvu, and multiply. So you can hear that. He says, revu, multiply. Like become great numerically. Now there's something very powerful about that right there. In Hebrew thought, to be great means there's lots of you. And similarly, if there's lots of you, then you are great. So that's very powerful in and of itself, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Okay, so they can have the sense of being great. Now, let me ask you: have you ever seen a movie where they're the two opposing armies in ancient times or medieval times, and the archers come out and they start to what? They start to lob like a hail of arrows down on the other army, and the arrows are all like coming down, and they're all hiding under their shields, and getting poked in the leg, and horrible things like that. A hail of arrows. So the Hebrew word for shooting arrows is related to the Hebrew word for lots of something. A hail of arrows. It's like basically, if you have the army in Hebrew thought that has the most archers that are able to fire the most arrows, then you are a superior force. You are great. You are greater. So can you see how like these concepts are all related in Hebrew? The concept for being great, the concept for numerically there being lots of something, the concept for fighting, and the concept for shooting arrows. They're all related. Now what's fascinating is there's this cloud of words, so to speak, and they all have these interrelated meanings, and then from that we get this Hebrew word for a rabbi, someone who is great, a rav. And then if that person is your rav, then you call them rabbi. You call them rabbi. Almost sounds like Robbie. Do you know any Robbies in your life? You should be like, hey, Robbie, I should tell you what your name means. Have you ever considered becoming an archer? Okay, all right. So them's the facts. Like, that's kind of just the raw data, what I gave you. Now let's actually talk about what that means, or interpret that, and what it has to tell us about the Messiah. All right, because the Messiah is the rabbi. The Messiah is our rabbi. What do you think? I mean, seriously, you should even just maybe pause this lesson and just think about that and see what comes to you. See what that tells you about Yeshua and who he is and what he does. Firstly, let's just talk about archery. There's something about an archer, something about a person with a bow shooting arrows that's a picture of a rabbi, a teacher. I can think of two ways that this is a very meaningful picture. Firstly, if you're a teacher, then it's like your lessons are arrows, or the words that you're using to communicate the concepts that you're trying to get across are like arrows. So, they're shooting at a specific target. You have them directed towards an objective. Hopefully you're not just talking. And so you're like an archer in that regard. Now, this is also very meaningful, a picture of the Messiah, because what did Yeshua do? Yeshua sent out his disciples into all the world. Almost like how an archer would send out his arrows, Yeshua sent out his disciples. Interestingly enough, this is also a picture of children in Scripture. It's like, it talks about, having a quiver full of arrows of children, kind of like that. So it's almost like your children are your arrows that you send out into the world, just like Yeshua's disciples were his spiritual sons and daughters that he sent out into the world. Now, something really interesting about that, the Hebrew word Torah, it's often translated as law, but it has the sense of teaching. It comes from the verb yara, which means to teach, but which also means to shoot an arrow at a target. So it's really interesting. Like basically we have these two Hebrew words for teacher. There's moreh, which means a teacher who teaches Torah. And then we have, a rabbi, which means someone who shoots arrows. And they both come from these two separate Hebrew words for shooting an arrow. So, maybe some of you aren't into archery, but you like guns. If you like shooting guns, next time you go to the shooting range, remember that there's something about that act that's a picture of what Jesus does. So next time you go to the shooting range, go with God and let that be like a little object lesson for you about the mission of the Messiah. Shooting guns, shooting arrows. There's something very spiritually profound to that. And so you can definitely make your outing more spiritual now. Oh, you can thank me for that fact. Maybe take me out shooting with you sometime. I would appreciate that. All right. So that's the first thing. An archer is a picture of a rabbi. And then what are the other two things? Well, I mentioned like fighting, for instance. If you're a teacher, you are fighting, ideologically speaking. You're fighting for the minds of the people that you are attempting to inform and to influence. So really, it's an ideological battle. And so Yeshua is it really is a battle of truth. And Scripture talks about that too. We fight not against flesh and blood, against human beings, but rather it's a spiritual fight. Paul talked about taking every thought captive. Our weapons aren't physical weapons, so to speak, but rather it's all in the mind. So you can see that theme there tied into this just the reality communicated by these Hebrew words. And then finally, this is really big also. It's the word to multiply, to be numerically great. What did Yeshua send his disciples to do? To go into all the world, go to all the nations, make disciples. Make disciples. Just like God told Adam and Eve, multiply yourselves. Basically, Yeshua told that early Messianic community, multiply yourselves all around the world. There's a little inner circle of you here. Now go out and let there be lots of you. And that was God's blessing to humanity. And we've done a great job being fruitful and multiplying. And, people don't really get together and make babies because they have to either. They do it because they want to, because, that's how the power of God's blessing. And similarly, we as disciples of the Master have multiplied around the world. And it's just built into our spiritual DNA. It's a very deep drive within us to do that. And the more disciples we make, the greater the name of Messiah in this world, and the greater his kingdom on this planet. So that is something that I just wanted to share with you from this verse in Genesis about the archers shooting at Joseph, so to speak, and how that's actually related to the Hebrew word for rabbi. Hopefully this has helped you to understand Yeshua better, who he is and who he was, what he did and what he's doing today, what he wants to do in your life. And also for those of us who are teachers, maybe this inspires you a little bit also to get a bow and start shooting arrows and see if maybe you don't learn something new about your job. Anyways, this was just one takeaway from our Hebrew verses lesson. We read the last half of Genesis chapter 49. There are several other ways that this chapter points to the Messiah that you're only going to get in the Hebrew because these blessings from Jacob to his sons were highly poetic, and so it uses a different set of words than what's usually used in Hebrew texts. There's some deep meanings. There's wordplay involved. And as we read through this chapter, I unpacked all of that and we talked about it in greater detail. I would love to have you learning with us. As I mentioned, I'm the founding teacher of Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. Our focus as a school is on following Yeshua of Nazareth in a Hebrew way together. So coming closer to Rabbi Jesus in that original Jewish context of the Bible. That's basic discipleship. It's a basic Bible study, and the together part of that just means that we're not just an online school. We're a community all around the world, and we love each other. We're becoming friends. We're supporting each other, and we have different ways on our website for you to connect with our student body, so to speak. So check us out at holylanguage.com. This is your invitation to join, and in the meantime, I just hope that this helped you to understand Yeshua a little better and come a little bit closer to him. Thanks for joining me in this little talk.